Hi there, welcome back. In today's tutorial, we're going to be talking all about skin coloring and correcting skin color in your portraits. Hi there, my name is Daniel Allen. Welcome to my YouTube channel where we talk about photography, portraits, landscapes, and working within Photoshop and Lightroom for doing the post-production editing. In today's tutorial, we're going to be talking about skin color correction. And skin color correction, sometimes it's really obvious that you need to correct the skin tones in your photo. Other times, not so obvious. But it doesn't mean you don't need to look at it. It's something that I look at in every single photo to try and see if there are any kind of corrections that are needed for the image that I'm working on. So let's dive right into Photoshop and take a look at this particular image of Dimitri. And this was done on a shoot that I did for a adult themed store, novelty store. So it's got some kind of the fetish wear that they sold there. And you know, I've already done the corrections that I wanted to do to, you know, the image as far as like covering up skin blemishes and some minimal liquefying, so forth. And this is the point where I would be looking at the skin color tone. So to make sure that the tone looks good. And right off the bat, it doesn't look all that bad. But when you start to notice it is when, like in the face and in the lower neck area, and particularly the ears. You notice a lot of times in photos that the ears are very red. Sometimes it comes from the light shining through the very, you know, thin, sensitive, you know, material here in the ear. Other times it can just be a flushing, skin's getting flushed. It could be sunburn, a lot of different things. But well, let's take a look at how much correction needs to be done here. I'm going to open up my adjustment layers. I'm going to create a new Hue Saturation adjustment layer, and I'm going to put it all the way up at the top up here on top of everything. Next, I'm going to grab the saturation slider and I'm going to pull it all the way over to the right so that you can take a look at all of the tones in their full saturation. And you can see that his skin is a lot of yellow and a little bit of red, particularly like I had mentioned in the lower neck and face and ear. There's a lot of those kinds of tones, and you can approach it in different ways, but the idea here is that when you pull this up, the colors for the skin should be pretty much even all the way across. They typically are a little bit more on the red side versus the yellow side. It depends on the photo. Sometimes on the skin tone, you know, everybody has different skin tones, but for your average Caucasian, you will see that it should be probably more of a red kind of tone. It looks just fleshy and alive, and so that's a good measure for that. So so we're going to correct this, try and even those out. And first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to just go ahead and put everything into a group called skin color correction. And this is partly for organization, but also so I can dial back the opacity of all of these changes that I make. In case I go too strong, I can dial back all of the changes I've made and kind of get that, you know, right amount that I do. Typically I overcorrect on a lot of stuff, and so that opacity slider helps me out quite a bit. I have this kind of philosophy: adjust it so it looks perfect, then dial it back so it looks real. That's more often than not kind of what I end up doing with the photos. So first thing we're going to do in the Hue Saturation layer, or in the skin color correction layer, we're going to put a Hue Saturation adjustment layer. And this one, we're going to try and dial back some of the, we're going to target the reds and the yellows and try and even these out as much as possible with this adjustment layer. So if you've never used this before, and Adobe, if you're listening to this video by some chance, this slider at the bottom is horrible to use. You have to be really on target to grab the little knobs and sliders and stuff and adjust them. But basically the gist of it is this gray part in the middle is your target area. Actually, I'm going to bump the saturation all the way up here so we can see what's going on. So this gray area here is the part that you are targeting with this adjustment. And then as you bring these out, this darker gray area is more of a graduated kind of filter to feather that selection out. So you're not doing all of your changes as harsh there on the edges as you are in the center. So it starts out really strong in the center and then feathers out as we go out. And you can kind of see this. The top rainbow band is the color spectrum for the photo that you have. So it starts out with cyans on the left and goes through all the colors and ends with the cyan again on the right. And that's just to signify that it loops around as a circle. And if we come here and we change the hue, you'll see in the bottom, like let's change it to over to here. You can see on the bottom that it is changing these tones in the center to the cyan, and then it's feathering it out on both sides back to what the original color would be. So that is how those bands work. And if we adjust this out, it gets more selected. If we drag it in, it gets less selected. Put that back to where it was. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take this red layer and I'm going to drag it back and forth. I'm going to try and get as narrow as I can here. And I want to try and target the very reddest of areas. And if you remember right, with this one, the reddest areas were in the chest and the face and the ear. So we're going to drag until we start to see mostly those tones. There we go. And then I'm going to feather it out. Not a ton, just a little. There we go. So now we have the reddest of the tones selected, and with it still at 100% saturation, I'm going to drag this over until I start to see those reds kind of disappear. And you want to make sure you don't go too far, because then you'll start to get into super yellow territory, and we don't really want that either. But let's actually, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and just bump this all the way over to like 17. It's overdone, but then you'll see what I'm going to do here in a second. I'm going to 18, 17, yeah, somewhere in there is good. There we go. So now it's overdone. Now everything is yellow. If we pull on this layer here with the saturation, we can see we've gotten rid of the reds. We've made it the same color as everything else. And that's perfect. That's exactly what we wanted. So now skin color is corrected. I'm going to drop the saturation to 0, and you look and there is it looks absolutely hideous, which is not by mistake. So the next thing we're going to do is come down here to the yellows, and we're going to kind of counteract that a little bit by making the reds, yellows a little bit more red, and that'll bring it back into the kind of flush pink tones that we want to see for this area. And same thing as before, drag the saturation all the way up here, drag the feathering sliders over to the edge, and you can see how hard it is to actually grab some of these. It's really kind of a pain. So again, Adobe, if you're listening, this interface could really use a little bit of help. I want to try and select as much of this as I can. As much of the skin color as I can without selecting extra. I don't want to go outside of it. I just want to select what I need, nothing else. And now I'm going to feather this out. There we go. And drag the hue. This time, so if you saw what I did last time, we were in the reds. If you look up here on the color spectrum, reds are over here on the left, yellows were toward the right. So that's why I knew I needed to drag the slider to the right to get more yellow into the photo. So now I'm going to drag this, and see as I come over here, I'm dragging it to the left because red is to the left of yellow. So I'm going to be subtracting back out to get the tone to where I want it. And I'm going to just do So you would think I'd want to go like this to even out the skin tones. I don't. I want to do like a blend. I probably want to do something like this. There will be some variations in the skin tone anyways. There's no way around it. So the key is just to try and get something that is just going to look natural. And if we take that saturation back down again, saturation gone. We've actually got some weird coloration going on in the knuckles here and also in the chest. It's almost like there's something wrong with my selection here. And I think I see what it is. If you look at the bottom band here, the bottom band lets you know what your selection looks like with the current changes. So the bottom band represents what the changes are after you've applied the top, the coloring changes. So I'm going to reset this hue on this one and come back over here to the reds because I can see that there is a little bit of, there we go, feathering that needs to happen. As you could see that before there was this bright band of reds that were stuck in there, and we don't want that. There we go. That's a nice gradual transition on the bottom there from the oranges into the yellows. We're not going to have any kind of weird banding now. If we come back over here to this other one, let's make sure we still got a good selection on the skin tone, and we do. And so now I'm going to drag this down to about there. And see how the coloration is just a lot more even now, which is cool. And we don't have that weird coloring on the knuckles anymore. And the skin tones just look really, really good. So if we turn this layer on and off, there's before, and then here's after. We can see that the color is a lot more even now than it was before. And let's do that again with this really bright saturation layer on top. So there it is currently. That's what it was originally. And here's what it is now. So that is a lot better. I'm actually quite happy with that. Next thing we're going to do, we want to make sure that we actually mask out areas that we don't want affected by this. So right now, if you look, we can see that the eyes and fingernails were changed as part of this. If we come back in here, go to the reds, bump up saturation all the way, you can see that the selected area also included fingernails and the eyes, and we don't want those selected because that will cause some discoloration in those areas, and it's going to look funny. So we're going to grab our brush, and I'm going to put the flow up, fairly high, like around 30%. Make sure that black is the foreground color. If you need to reset it, you could reset it here with the little reset box and then toggle them back and forth like that, or you can press the X key as well. And I have a feathered, a soft brush selected, and I'm just going to mask out the eyes right here. And it doesn't have to be super careful with that, just because it's not a strong adjustment that's happening there. So if it's off just a little bit, you won't see it that much. But you do want to, take some time and make sure that you get these areas good. And then I always suggest that you press the Alt key, Alt or Option, and click on the mask and just check out to make sure that you have selected everything properly. There's no, gray areas that, didn't fully get filled in. Just as a sanity check. It's not always necessary, but it is. And then I also saw that the hair was getting adjusted too, which I don't really mind in this case. So I think I'm just going to leave it. But if you had a certain colored hair that you wanted to make sure didn't get changed, you would also mask that out as well. So next thing we're going to do is create a saturation map. And if you've never done a saturation map before, they're actually really cool. So what you do is you're basically creating a map of color intensities, hue intensities, saturation intensities. So the more saturated something is, the brighter it is in your map. And the less saturated it is, the less selected it is in the map. It's more dark. It's like black. So the idea here is that you can use that map to target the most saturated areas in your photo and bring those down in kind of a natural way instead of a across the board swath of, you know, take down, desaturate everything, so that the stuff that wasn't really saturated now is basically black and white, and the things that you really wanted to desaturate, you know, still may need more desaturation. So it's a good way of kind of targeting what you want to desaturate in your photos. It works great with landscapes, but it also works really good in portraits here, because typically the face, especially if you have red, ruddy complexion, typically is oversaturated quite a bit. So let me show you how to do one of these. It's really cool, and I plan on doing a tutorial here in the future about this, so to go over how to do it. I just did a stamp visible, which was Control-Alt-Shift-E or Option-Shift-Command-E on the Mac. I'm still learning those keys. I'm not a Mac guy. And what that does is that creates a stamp of the visible layer. You can also come up, believe it's layer and stamp visible. I am not seeing it, but it is there. Trust me. I'm not going to waste time looking for it. It's there. I always use the keyboard shortcut, so sorry about that. So now that we have this stamped visible of our project, we come up here to Filter, Other, and HSB HSL. And if you've never used this before, this is basically how you would go about getting a saturation mask for your project. The input mode, we're going to leave it RGB, which is red, green, blue. And the row order, we're going to change to HSL, which is Hue, Saturation, Luminosity. And we'll say OK. And this runs a bunch of calculations. Then you come over here to the channels. And on the channel, your green is going to be the saturation. So if we click on this, we'll see that the black areas were the stuff that were least saturated, and the whiter areas, the lighter the areas are, the more saturated it is. So that kind of gives you a hint. Blue should just be a luminosity mask. And then, you know, red, this is, I'm actually not sure how this one is translated. I would have to look into that a little bit more. Because that should be hue, but I have no idea how that works exactly. So, but we want this green one, so we're going to control or command click the green, or you can use the little select button at the bottom. The select button will also select it. And what we're doing is selecting the pixels that we want to use from that mask. So that selects that mask. We come back up here to RGB to turn all those back on again. It's actually a very important step, because if you don't do that, then you're going to be stuck in that green channel, which you don't want to do. And then we can just delete this. We can get rid of this layer altogether, drag it down to the trash can, and we're done with it. Then the next thing, we're going to create a Hue Saturation Adjustment layer, and because we had a selection active, it defaulted that to the mask for the Hue Saturation Adjustment layer. If we Option or Alt click on that layer, we'll see that now we have it here for us. And I always find that the selection on these is not quite good enough. I typically want to have the most dynamic range in these masks. So I will often come up here to Image and Adjustments and Curves while the mask is visible on the screen. And I will drag this over. Actually, you can do Auto, and Auto will automatically take it to where you have the brightest whites and the darkest blacks, and it should automatically do that for you. But you can go a little bit more, a little bit less, depending on what you want to do. I'm going to leave it right where Photoshop suggests, because I know that it's got the whitest already set for the most saturated, so that's good for me. I'm going to say OK, and if I Option Alt click out of that, I can come back over here to the Hue and Saturation, and I can just drop the saturation like this, and you'll see that it's dropping the saturation from the most saturated areas first, which is amazing. And actually, so if we drop it all the way down like this, you can see that there's still color in the photo. But if I take the Shift key and I click on the mask to disable it, we'll see that it's actually supposed to be black and white at this point. But because we have this mask selected, it is just feathering out those adjustments so that only the most saturated stuff is coming down first, and it's preserving everything else, which is awesome. It's the greatest way to color grade or to adjust or control the saturation of your skin tones in portraits, and it also works fabulous for landscapes as well. So, like for example, you could take this saturation mask in a landscape and then invert it and then boost your saturation so that everything that was less saturated gets saturated first, and then things that already were saturated don't get as much saturation. So it can be really powerful. All right, and next thing I want to do is add a black and white filter to the skin. I really didn't have an appreciation for this editing technique until fairly recently, but there's a lot of power you can have with editing with a black and white filter on a color photo. It's kind of counterintuitive, but it works fantastic, and let me show you how that works. So I'm going to add a black and white filter. Let's see, where is it? There it is. And right away you see that everything is turned to black and white, because that's ideally what this filter is for. And you'll notice that it gives you some really cool things for brightening and darkening certain tonal ranges in your photo. So right off the bat, we can see that the reds right here, if we drag it down, it's going to make my skin colors really dark. Same with if I bring it over, it's going to brighten them. Reset that. What else was there in there? His eyes, I believe, had a lot of yellows in them. Well, so does skin. So typically with portraits, it's the yellows and the reds that have the most power. But you can see that we're darkening and we're brightening by sliding on those. And the same is true with these other sliders as well. The background had a lot of blue in it, so if I darken that, well, I guess the mask does too. You know, I'm kind of darkening the highlight there in the leather. There was a bunch in the background, I thought. Anyways, I'm not seeing it. Magentas, I believe, also were in the background. But it kind of adds more noise than anything else, so I don't really want to do that. What I am going to do, though, is I'm going to change this the saturation layer to Luminosity. And the reason I'm going to do that is because I want to keep it as a black and white, but I want to just kind of darken and lighten things as, you know, as what'll look good. So for the reds, I think I'm going to go, I'm going to play with these, try darkening them, see what happens, try lightening them, see what happens. I always try to go to the extremes first so I can get a real feel for what the slider is capable of doing. And then I kind of dial in what I want to do for a change. And I think for this, I want to darken the reds just a bit. Maybe even around 36. Yeah, there. That's probably good. Same thing with the yellows. So with the yellows, I'm going to try darkening first. Oof, that's awful. So I'm probably not going to darken it because it just looks terrible. How about lightening it? Lightening will definitely brighten his skin up a little bit. So usually I try to do opposites with the red and the yellow. So reds are typically the shadow area of a portrait, with most Caucasian skin tones at least. The reds are typically the more the shadow area, so darkening those areas makes sense. And then the yellows are typically the more highlighted areas, so that usually kind of makes sense for brightening up the highlights. So for this one, I think I'm going to, let's see, do right about 80s. Yeah, right about there. That looks good. Maybe a little bit more. Yeah, that looks good. So if I turn this on and off, you can see the difference it makes. It's not a ton, but it does help to, you know, sculpt and color the skin tones a bit. So that's good. And the last thing I want to do is work with the luminosity, do some luminosity masking. And I'm going to do that so I have the TK actions menu, which is really cool. And I can create like this luminosity mask like this, and that works fantastic. But instead, I think I'm going to show you the old-fashioned way of doing it without the TK actions menu. Feel free to grab it. It's really powerful, and I love using it in my photography. But I'm just going to do it this way first and show you. I'm going to Control Alt click on the RGB channel, and that will select the luminance ranges. And then I'm going to come back over here to layers, and I'm going to create a curves layer. And you'll see if I hold down the alter option, if I click on that, we have a black and white representation of our photo. And that is just the luminance mask of that photo. I want to target more of just the highlights. So I'm going to open up the curves layer on this mask, and I'm going to just darken it up by doing this. And that makes the darker areas of the photos and the shadows, it just drops those out considerably. And I'm going to also brighten this up just a bit. There we go. Just so that those highlights are getting really close to being clipped, because I really want to accentuate those. So now we have this nice kind of range in here of what is selected in this mask, and it's going to be kind of the darker parts of my midtones through, and it's going to kind of feather its way up to the bottom part of my whites, and then it's going to be clipped at that point. So I'm going to say OK here. Option or Alt click back on the mask to exit out of that view and show my photo again. And now if I pull up the curves over here, I can drag this down to brighten up more of the highlights in the photo. And if I want to, I can also drag down on the curve here to kind of reset it back to the diagonal line. There's a diagonal line that runs across the curves, and that's where 0 is. I haven't made any changes. That's just what it normally is. And if I want to cut this out of some of the darker areas, I can just grab this down like this and pull it down. It's not a good idea to darken too much because that looks goofy, as you can see here. It's rather just taking that effect away in the darker areas. I just really want the brightest parts blown out a bit. And I can bring this up even more. I can curve it if I want to just really, really accentuate those, but it looks goofy. So, and if you don't know this, you can grab the dots here, the little points, and pull them off to get rid of them. But I think what I want to do here is probably just I want to make sure the forehead gets nice highlights and the hand. But as you can see here, I'm kind of blowing out this side of the pectoral here a little bit. So what I'm going to do is come over here to my curve, and I'm going to grab the burn tool, and I'm going to burn this mask. So Alter Option to pull up the mask, and I want to darken this area right here next to the arm. Make sure my exposure is somewhat low. It doesn't have to be super low, but just so I can kind of gradually add this into here. And I'm going to just darken this area, make sure that the highlights are selected on here so that I'm kind of leaving the dark areas alone, and I'm just darkening up those highlights. In fact, I should have done that to begin with, so I'm going to come back here in my history to there. Now I'm just getting those highlights and I'm darkening them. But because I'm using the burn layer, the burn tool, I'm not actually destroying any of the texture from this luminosity mask. I'm instead just kind of gradually bringing down the darkness of those areas, which is really cool. So we're going to turn this off again so you can see what we did. You know, that's still too much. Let's darken it some more. And you can do this as much as you want. Come in here and just darken it away. Let's try that, see how that is. That's better. I'm going to try and darken it without pulling up the... I think that is working. I didn't think this worked, so I thought you had to have the mask visible, but it does look like it works. Boy, that's going to save me a bunch of time. That's awesome. So there's before, there's after. I'm actually going to change this to luminosity because I'm getting some discoloration down in here and I don't want that. So before and after. I'm also going to probably feather out this darkening just a little bit. There we are. Okay, and one last thing I want to do here. This area in the chest is really kind of bothering me. It's much darker than the rest of the chest is, and I can't quite make sense in my head of what that is. When I look at it, is it a suntan? Is he, you know, flushed? Is it a weird shadow? I just can't make sense of it. So it's got to go. And here's how we're going to do it. We're going to come down here to the curves adjustment layer, pop one of those in there, and we're going to select on the little adjustment hand. Up in the top left, you'll see sample size. You want to make sure that that is 3x3 or 5x5, depending on your photo and the type of image area that you're trying to select from. Usually 3x3 or 5x5 is usually good, but in this case, the skin has a lot of texture in it. I want to try and target the specific texture that I'm looking for, the specific colors. So I'm going to go with a 3x3 average, and I'm going to come down here to the darkest area of the chest, click on it, and drag up until that starts to go away. And I'm noticing some color shift. So whenever you see color shift, go down here, switch it to luminosity only, and then that should hopefully counteract the color shift that you're seeing. Next, I'm going to come down here to the brightest area on the chest, click it, and drag down to remove the adjustment from those areas. And you'll see it has this kind of washed out look to it, which is totally fine. We're going to take care of that here in a second. Grab and maybe drag this up just a... Nope, don't like that. Let me undo that. There we go. Let's just leave it like that for right now. We can fine tune this later if we want to. But the magic comes in by coming over here to this mask and inverting it. And then I'm going to take the brush, make sure foreground color is white, nice low flow with a soft round brush, and I'm going to paint white onto this mask in the areas where I want to brighten it. I'm going to undo that and make it just a little bit bigger. Do like a big swath of color of lightning through here. Try and make it as even as possible. Make sure to come down into the chest area, also down here by this thumb, and then I can back that out later. And I'm using the bracket keys to size the brush. I'm just doing it with a really cool Wacom tablet, actually. So one of these days I'll do a video of my gear that I have here, but for editing. You can do all of these edits with a mouse, but it's going to be harder. It's definitely a worthwhile investment to get a Wacom tablet. And I am going to try and even out some of these dark patchy areas a bit with this layer, bouncing back and forth between the dark and the light adjustment modes, dark and light color on the brushes. And let's hit the Alt key, Alt or Option, and click on the mask and see how we're doing here. It's, you know, it's okay that these are patchy because we're just kind of taking the effect away from certain areas, but I do want to be very, very careful that I'm not creating more patchiness because of uneven brush strokes. So I'm going to come in here and kind of try and even this out a little bit and hopefully make sure I'm not creating more patchiness, because I don't want to do that. And it's okay to come down in here into this chest area. If you remember right, what we did is we just kind of took away some of the texture, which is, you know, it's okay. We don't want to do that a whole ton, but that's why we raised, we darkened the brightest parts of the skin for that very reason, so that we could kind of feather that effect into the brighter areas and be okay. So if we do it like a before and an after, I think I need to probably bring back some of the effect here just to try and make sure that the neck looks realistic. That looks pretty darn good. Maybe a little bit more in here. And I can actually kind of reduce some of the texture into here as well, because I think that texture is just a little too much. There we go. I think that looks good. So here's before, and then here's after. Kind of evens out that chest quite a bit, which I think is really nice and gives it a nice, good look. So let's take a look at everything all together for the skin color adjustments. Here is before, and then this is after. You can see just a world of difference. Probably could come back in here and fine tune this quite a bit more too, but I think this is the best. I think this is a good stopping point for the video. I'd probably just come in and maybe tweak a little bit of the masking, maybe a little bit of the curves adjustments on the sliders, just a little bit more. Probably come back and enhance the eyes a bit, but you know, for the most part, I think this is I think we did a fantastic job. And here's the last step, which is turning back on this hue saturation layer at the top. And as you can see, the colors now are pretty darn even, except for the eyes and the fingernails, which is where we deliberately masked out the color shift. So color nice and even again. And here's what it was before. So you can see, you know, we really did make a huge difference on this photo. Well, that's it for this tutorial. And if you like my content today, feel free to hit that like button. Or, you know, subscribe, hit the bell so you get the notifications. I try and put out stuff that's pretty relevant and pretty cool, and things that hopefully will help you out in your photography. If you have suggestions on ideas that you would like to have videos created for, let me know down in the comments. Or if you you know, have any photos that you have used this on, I would love to see some of them. Hashtag on Instagram is at Daniel Allen Studio Arts, and look forward to seeing you on the next video. Take care.